Good morning. Firstly, thank you to our sponsor. She's not here, but Marla, for sponsoring our breakfast. You could tell her that we mentioned her name. And anyone who wants to sponsor a future breakfast, let us know. And before I get into the Parsha, I just want to mention tomorrow is a special day. Tomorrow is the 20th of the month of Av. It is the Yartzeit, the anniversary of the passing of the Rebbe's father, whose name was Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson. He was a leading rabbi in Russia, the Russian Empire, and then later the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, like many rabbis of his generation, he was arrested and sent to exile in Kazakhstan, and unfortunately he died there. Now be 82 years ago in 1944. So we once did a class, I think last year we did a class about him directly. This week's parsha is called Re'eh. Re'eh means see. It begins with Hashem, with Moshe continuing his speech to the people, and he tells the people, "See, I have placed you today a blessing and a curse, and you can follow the Torah and receive the blessing, or not follow the Torah and receive the curse." He then tells them that when they come to the Promised Land, they should go to two mountains near the city of Shechem, Mount Gerizim and Mount Eval. The Levites are going to stand in the middle. Six tribes are going to stand on one side, 6 tribes on the other, and they'll turn to each mountain, and they will then state 11 blessings and 11 curses, which the blessings and curses themselves are going to be enumerated later in a couple weeks in Parshat Ki Tavo. And then the Torah tells us that when we come to the Promised Land, we will build first a temporary temple for Hashem, and we know that ended up being built in Shiloh. Once you build a temporary temple, you're not allowed to bring sacrifices anywhere else. And then we're told that we're going to build a permanent temple. It doesn't say where, but we know that later that would be in Jerusalem, that the permanent temple would be in Jerusalem. Once the permanent temple is chosen, it's forbidden to bring sacrifices anywhere else. I should point out that while the last 3 weeks, Moshe gave a speech to the people, and in each of his talks, throughout his speech, he reminded the people of their past misdeeds and of previous events that happened to them, and admonished them and inspired them. Starting this week, we really focus on commandments. So it goes through many, many commandments. It tells us that although in the desert they were forbidden from eating meat just because they wanted to without bringing a sacrifice. However, once the temple is built and they will be too far, once they're settled in the land of Israel, and they'll be too far from the temple to bring a sacrifice whenever they want to eat meat. Unlike in the desert where they're right nearby, they will be able to eat meat wherever they want. However, we're warned against the prohibition of eating blood, and we're also warned that the sacrifices must be brought to the temple. The Torah then continues to warn the people that if you have a false prophet that tells people to worship, how do you know he's a false prophet? Because he says that people should worship idols or should go against the Torah, then you know that Hashem is testing you, and do not listen to such a prophet. The Torah then continues to say that if a Jew tries to convince another Jew to leave the path of the Torah, then they must, if they try to convince another Jew to leave the path of the Torah, then they must, we must punish that person. There's a death penalty if they try to get them to worship idols, and we should not have any pity on such a person. And that's always been the Jewish policy. While we're welcome everyone, no matter what they have done, we have a rule, Afal Pi Shechata Yisrael Hu, even though someone sins, they remain Jewish and part of the Jewish community. That only lasts until they try to proselytize and convince others to leave the Jewish path. Anyone who does so is immediately ostracized from the community. Then the Torah tells the laws of an entire city that worshipped idols, that the city must be destroyed. And then the Torah moves on to the laws of kosher, which are already mentioned earlier in the book of Leviticus in Parshat Shmini. And it goes through firstly kosher animals that you're allowed to eat, any animal that chews its cud and has split hooves. If it doesn't, you're not allowed to eat it. Fish, animals that have fins and scales. Birds, it gives us a list of birds that we are not allowed to eat and every other bird we are allowed to eat. We've previously spoken about what makes animals kosher. We did a separate class on what makes fish kosher, and we've done a separate class on what makes birds kosher. The Torah then Moshe then commands the people to separate 10% of their produce and bring it to the temple, to Jerusalem, and eat it in Jerusalem. If the produce is too much to bring to Jerusalem, they should. If the produce is too much to bring to Jerusalem, they can exchange it for money and bring the money to Jerusalem instead. I'm not going to go through all the commandments, but just some of them. Every 7 years, all loans are absolved, something that we still do today, but we have a certain workaround. We once did a class on that also. Last time we had a Shemitah year. We're then given the commandment of giving charity, that if somebody is in need, you must open your hand and give them whatever they need. And there will always be poor people, but we must always make sure to take care of them. Then the parsha finishes with the going over the laws of the festivals. First Passover, Shavuot, and then finally Sukkot. And covering the laws of each of the festivals. So that is the parsha in short. I'll open it quickly to any questions, and then I will get to our topic for today, which is about mixing fish and meat. Yes, Adele?
Yeah, so it sounds like they maybe didn't eat meat on a regular, bologna sandwiches or whatever, because everything had to be brought to the temple.
So the rule was that when they were in the desert, they had to bring all sacrifices to the temple, all meat to the temple. They could not slaughter meat on their own. The temple wasn't very far. You could only eat meat as a sacrificial animal, and that was it. The same would be later in Jerusalem. In the city of Jerusalem, the sages made a rule that all meat eaten should only be sacrificial meat. In other words, if you want to eat meat in Jerusalem, bring a sacrifice and eat sacrificial meat. However, outside of Jerusalem, you can slaughter, and we do that today. You can slaughter and choose to eat meat. Now, why we eat meat and what the Torah's view on meat in general, we did a class on Judaism and vegetarianism, and we've spoken about meat eating and the values of that, whether it is a value or it's not. We've spoken about that previously. So let's cover today's topic, which is mixing fish and meat. If you go today to a traditional Shabbat dinner, anywhere in the world, of any Jewish culture, of any Jewish background, there's a lot of different Jewish communities, you will see that some things they all have in common. It's a multi-course meal. The meal generally starts with the kiddush, the blessing on the wine. Then then they cut the challah, the bread. And then after cutting the challah, there's usually multiple additional courses. The first course is usually a fish and salad course, sometimes other things as well. Following that, there is then usually a soup course, usually chicken soup. That's an old Jewish thing. All Jewish communities, Sephardi and Ashkenazi. The knedelach is, of course, or the noodles is, of course, Ashkenazi, but all Jews, Sephardi and Ashkenazi, had chicken soup. And that was usually followed by a main course, which was usually meat, and then that's followed usually by a dessert of some sort. And so this is pretty similar to a standard menu of a dinner that you would go to. If you'd go to a restaurant, you'd go to a nice dinner, you'd have a somewhat similar multi-course menu with some differences. Now, the reason why we have a multi-course menu for our Shabbat dinner is, well, we want to have a fancy dinner, and why not have a multi-course menu? But there actually are, like most of the things that we do, many of the things that we do in Jewish culture, there are actually halachic reasons why the courses are split and ordered the way they are, and that is due to our unique kosher laws. Milk and meat together, but from eating milk and meat cooked together. And our sages went even further and said, do not eat milk and meat together, even if they are not cooked together, or fowl and milk together, even if they are not cooked together. The Torah does not prohibit eating fish and meat together. However, our sages in the Talmud, in Psachim 76b, say that one should not eat fish and meat together because it causes a harmful smell and it leads to a skin ailment called tzarat. Tzarat can be the ancient skin ailment discussed in the Torah, or in Talmudic literature, it usually refers to leprosy. So because of this statement, not to eat fish and meat together because of the danger involved, it's not clear what kind of smell comes as a result, but that's what it says. So because of that, most halachic authorities have said that the law, the Torah law that is, the Jewish law, bans us from cooking fish and meat together, or even eating fish and meat together. And this is based on a principle that we are required to be healthy, and we are forbidden from doing anything that is unhealthy or harmful. And in fact, it's even stricter than ritual prohibitions, as our sages say, chamira sakanta me'isura, danger, things that we avoid because of danger are even more stringent than things we avoid because of ritual prohibitions. Now, this law that we do not eat fish or meat together because of the danger is quoted by most halachic authorities, and it is brought in Shulchan Aruch, which is the primary code of Jewish law, as set law, and it is accepted by all Jewish communities without exception, except this prohibition, and have always, as far as we know. Some may argue there may be medieval scholars that maybe didn't agree that this is a set law. However, by and large, the accepted halacha for, at least in recent history, without a question, probably throughout most of our history, was that we are forbidden from eating meat or fish together. Now, some of you may be concerned that the dangers that the Torah that the Talmud spoke about, we cannot medically prove those dangers today. In fact, there's no medical basis for such dangers. And I'm going to ask you, that's a very valid question, and I'm going to ask you to hold that question. I first want to talk about the rules of what we actually do, and then I'll get to the why we do it. Okay, so the prohibition first. What is the prohibition? The prohibition is firstly meat or fowl. We generally put meat and fowl in the same category for kosher laws. So any meat from animals or fowl, or any derivative of meat or fowl, is forbidden to be eaten with any fish or any derivative of fish. So we're not allowed to cook them together, even if it's just one ingredient that is a meat or fowl derivative. You cannot put it with another ingredient that is a fish derivative in the same dish, or even on the same plate. So not only should we not have a dish with fish and meat together, we have to be careful not to even eat them on the same plate at the same time, so they do not touch each other. We go so far as to avoid even putting fish and meat on the table at the same time without some form of separation. And today, at least in this part of the country, where people like to have buffets for their dinners, you will see if you go to a kosher place, there will always be separate tables for fish buffet and meat buffet. They will always be separated, and usually there will be a sign, fish buffet and meat buffet, that people should know not to confuse them, not to eat them together. So we try to avoid even having them on the same table. Now, we can eat one and then the other. That's fine. Unlike milk and meat, where we have, after eating meat, we wait 6 hours before eating anything dairy. After eating dairy, there's various customs, but at least we have to finish our meal and start a new meal before eating meat. Some wait an hour as well. When it comes to fish and meat, it's okay to eat fish and then eat meat. It's okay to eat meat and then eat fish. That's fine as long as you don't eat them together. However, the accepted custom is that we try to eat fish first and then meat. And that's because it's adequate or proper to always eat the lighter food first. And fish is usually lighter than the meat. And that explains the classic Shabbat dinner. On a regular Shabbat dinner, we start with our fish course. You have to serve fish separately from the chicken soup, separately from the main course, which is going to be meat or fowl. So you start with your fish course, which is usually fish and salads, because it's kind of an appetizer. While when you go to a restaurant and many dinners, they usually start with the soup. We don't start with the soup because the soup is usually chicken soup. And while you can technically have fish after fowl or meat, we try to avoid that. And so we have first the fish or the salad and then serve the soup afterwards. And then we have only after that do we have our main course on a separate plate with separate dishes.
Is there a certain amount of time between eating one?
You don't have to wait any time. No.
You just finish one and then
However, between eating fish and meat, or vice versa, if you choose to do so, which is, again, it's okay to eat meat or fowl first and then fish, but we try to avoid it. It's not forbidden. But between eating fish and meat, which we do every Shabbat, one should always clean their mouth first. And one does that by eating something and drinking something in between. So you should have something to eat, a bite to eat, and something to drink between eating fish and eating meat. It can be the challah on the table and a cup of water, or it can be something else on your plate or on the table, whether part of the fish course, some salad, or part of the meat course. Maybe there's a side dish or something like that. That's fine as long as you eat something and drink something in between. Now, in Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law, it says that one should also, and this is based on earlier medieval scholars, that one should also wash their hands in between eating fish and meat. So after eating fish and before eating meat, you get up and you go and wash your hands, just as we wash our hands before we start the meal. And we also have what we call mayim achronim, washing our hands after the meal. We also we should wash our hands between eating fish and meat. And however, Rav Moshe Israelis, we've spoken about this before, the Shulchan Aruch was written by Rav Yosef Karo, became the primary code. It was published around 1575, and it became the primary code of that Jews used for Jewish law. However, the author was a Sephardic Jew, and many of his rulings did not fit with common Ashkenazi rulings. And so a contemporary of his, the Ramah of Moshe Israelis of Krakow, wrote a commentary or glosses on the Shulchan Aruch, where he put in the Ashkenazic custom. The Ramah over there writes that we do not have to be strict today with washing our hands between fish and meat. Although we still don't eat fish and meat together, we don't have to wash our hands in between, given that we don't have any known danger of eating fish and meat together. And therefore, the widespread custom was that Sephardic Jews would wash their hands after eating fish before eating meat, while Ashkenazi Jews would not wash their hands. Now, today, it's hard to imagine how culture has changed, but today we generally don't touch the food that we eat with, other than perhaps the bread. Once upon a time, it was common that people ate with their hands, with their fingers. So the rule that one has to wash their hands between fish and meat was when people ate with their hands. Today that we no longer eat with our hands, are we still obligated to, are Sephardic Jews still obligated to wash their hands? That is an issue of debate between modern poskim, modern halachic scholars. I believe that most Sephardic Jews do not anymore wash their hands between fish and meat. Now, the prohibition of not eating fish and meat is not to eat them on the same plate, not to eat them together at the same time, and also not to cook them together. What if you have a minuscule amount of meat fell into a pot with fish, or a minuscule amount of fish fell into a pot with meat? So the rule is similar to the rules of kosher in general, and the rule of if meat and milk get mixed up. What if a little milk falls into your chicken soup? So as long as there is 60 times as much soup as milk fell in, it is okay. So what we call in Hebrew batel b'shishim, it becomes doesn't count anymore in 60 times as much. You'll say it works with the fish and the meat. If their dish is 60 times as much as fish fell in, or 60 times as much as meat fell in, it is we don't worry about it, and it is okay. Now, because of the concern, though, that we're not allowed to cook anything that has fish in it, even a little bit of fish, unless it's less than a 60th, but we're not allowed to cook anything that has a little bit of fish in it with meat. Because of this concern, most kosher certifications today in modern, where most food is produced commercially, and food may have many, many, many different ingredients, and the only way you know what's going into it and that everything going into it is kosher is because of the kosher certifications. We've previously done a class on the industrialization of kosher, and we spoke about how kosher certifications work today and how it evolves. So because of the issue of fish, they generally will label anything that has fish in it. You'll see the circle U or the circle K, the OU, the OK. You'll see the symbol, and you'll see it will say next to it fish, so that you know there is fish inside that product and you are not to use it with meat. So if you see the OU fish or the OK fish, you know that that product is not to be used with meat. I don't think fish is used widely as in most ingredients. I'll talk about one where it's used extremely widely in a second, but it's generally not used. So you're not going to see a lot of products in your average supermarket, but you will see it from time to time. A product that will say OU fish or OU meat. And if you do see that, then you know that it is, unless it's like unless it's tuna, they're not going to write OU fish on the tuna can. That's self-explanatory. But if there's a drop of fish that you may not know is in there, they will write fish on the label. There's, however, one ingredient which comes from fish that is very, very, very common in our food, and that is gelatin. Now, why is most gelatin from fish? So the truth is that 80 years ago, gelatin is used widely to help things bind, to help give a texture and help food bind together. And it's very, very commonly used in many, many commercial products. Now, historically, gelatin gelatin is usually made from bones. So historically, gelatin was usually made from meat bones. The problem is that if it's made from meat bones, is it kosher? Now, that was a big halachic debate that rose about 100 years ago. There was a big halachic debate. Is gelatin made from meat bones kosher? Meaning from non-kosher meat, that is, right? Made from non-kosher meat, right? Getting it only from the kosher meat would be hard. So gelatin made from non-kosher meat, is it kosher? Why should it be kosher if it's made from non-kosher meat? Well, the bone itself is not edible. The bone itself is not edible, and we're only forbidden from eating parts of an animal that are edible. The gelatin comes from the bone itself. So is a edible byproduct of a bone like gelatin, is it edible? Does it need to be kosher or not? So that was a big issue that was debated. Perhaps one day we could do a class on the kosher debate regarding gelatin, because it's a fascinating debate. Regardless, the accepted halacha today is, and really for 100 years, although there was debate about it, the accepted halacha is that gelatin needs to come from a kosher animal, or needs to come from kosher meat. If it's from something not kosher, the gelatin is not kosher. The product made with that gelatin, by extension, would not be kosher. So that became a huge issue. When the kosher certifications organizations started certifying various foods, they required them to move on to stop using gelatin. non-kosher gelatin. What do you use instead? So at the time, it wasn't, this is 80 years ago, it was less common, but it existed. They made gelatin also from fish bones. So over time, they started using fish gelatin. Now, what happened in the kosher industry is that the kosher industry has slowly, over the last 80 years, essentially taken over much of the commercial food market in this country, where the vast majority of non-fresh, commercially produced food today is kosher and certified kosher. And that means that ingredients, for the big ingredient suppliers, ingredients that are kosher can be used in most foods. Non-kosher ingredients have a very limited market, because the people buying it, big companies that are buying them, the Heinz and the Kraft and the big companies buying them, have most of their food certified as kosher. So if you have a kosher option or a non-kosher option, they're going to go with a kosher option. As a result, that over time entirely destroyed the market for meat gelatin. And meat gelatin, my understanding, not that I've ever tried to buy commercial gelatin, but meat gelatin today is virtually impossible to find. It's not made anymore. And all gelatin today is made out of fish. So that, yes. So there's a lot of other Jewish influences in the food industry, but not for now. So one day, God willing, we'll do a class on the gelatin. But to move on, more relevant to our particular discussion today. Okay, so that means that a very large percentage of the foods that you buy in the market are made of fish gelatin. Can you use those foods with meat? That would really limit our ability to eat. So, this was an issue that was also debated back in the day, and the generally accepted halacha is that given that the question of gelatin itself is debatable, there were some opinions that said gelatin should be okay. Some thought that it was not okay. And given that the issue of mixing fish and meat is not a regular biblical prohibition, but a later prohibition as a result of a danger of which, to the best of our knowledge, doesn't exist today. So therefore, generally, we take the more lenient approach when it comes to fish gelatin. And generally, and this is widely accepted, I don't know anyone who says otherwise, that generally we eat fish gelatin with meat without a problem. And today, many products in the supermarket have gelatin in them, a very large percentage of products, and we don't think twice of cooking it with meat, and we often cook it with meat without worrying about it. So we're careful not to cook meat and fish together. However, we can use the same utensils. We know that when it comes to milk and meat, we have to have different utensils. When it comes to milk, if you cook milk in a utensil, you don't use it for meat. If you cook meat in that utensil, you don't use it for milk. Not only that, our plates and our forks and our knives and all of our kitchen utensils, almost all of them, we separate milk from meat. And that's why any kosher kitchen has two of everything. 2 sets of pots and pans, 2 sets of dishes, 2 sets of cutlery. We have 2 sets of everything because we separate milk from meat. Anything that's used with milk, even clean, is not used with meat. That rule is only for milk and meat. We do not have that rule for fish and meat. So you can cook fish in your meat pot. You can cook fish in your meat pan. You can put it on the same plates. You can use the same forks as long as it's clean. So when we have our Shabbat dinner and you have a fish course, so the plate and fork you use for your fish course is taken away, you take it away and use a separate plate for your main course. Anyway, you usually use fresh plates for new courses. But we also are careful to have new cutlery, right? So we have multiple cutlery, one for each course, to make sure that we don't use the dirty cutlery that we use with our fish to use it with our meat in order to make sure that we don't mix it up. However, once the pot or plate or cutlery has been cleaned, then you are allowed to move back and forth between fish and meat. You don't need a separate kitchen just for fish. You're allowed to have you're allowed to eat your fish things cook your fish things in your meat pots and eat it on your meat plates. There is a custom in some communities, to have separate pots and pans for fish. So they cook fish in separate pots, or bake fish in separate pans, still in the same oven, but in separate pots and separate pans. I should mention, while I'm at that, talking about baking in the oven, we don't bake fish and meat in the same oven at the same time, because then the steam from one is going to go into the other. So that we don't do. But once you have used it and it is clean, you can then move back and forth between fish and meat, no problem. There is a custom in some communities to have separate pots and pans for fish. That is not universally done in most Jewish communities, and certainly not required. Even those that have separate pots and pans do not have separate plates or utensils. So till now, we've spoken about a prohibition of not eating meat and fish together that is mentioned in the Talmud. Now, Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch was a code that he wrote of Jewish law that goes through Jewish law and essentially gives you all the laws. And it became very, very popular, and today it's considered the standard, the classic law of code of Jewish law, so much so that it's become synonymous with Jewish law. So if someone says, I live by the Shulchan Aruch, it means I observe Jewish law. So it's become almost a synonym with Jewish law. However, Rav Yosef Karo also wrote another book on Jewish law called the Bet Yosef. The Bet Yosef, I think we once did a class on the Shulchan Aruch where we spoke about this in detail. The Bet Yosef is a comprehensive encyclopedic work or anthology that collects all the sources and explains the evolution of Jewish law until his day. Very, very important work. In the Bet Yosef, he writes that it is prohibited to cook, it is prohibited to eat fish and milk together because it is dangerous. Now, Rav Moshe Isserles, the Ramah, who wrote as we mentioned earlier, the glosses on the Shulchan Aruch, he writes in another book where he wrote also glosses on the Bet Yosef, he says he never heard of such a thing. He knows you're not allowed to eat fish and meat together. But whoever said fish and milk, never heard of such a thing. Doesn't know where such a thing comes from. Other Ashkenazi commentaries, classic commentaries said, that must be a mistake. There's no source for that. Where does it come from? That must be a mistake. And he meant to write, you're not allowed to eat fish and meat together. And by mistake, it's a typo. Instead of writing fish and meat, he wrote fish and milk. However, many Sephardic commentaries pointed out that no, he actually meant to write, you're not allowed to eat fish and milk together. And they point various earlier sources that said one should avoid eating fish and milk together. It's not mentioned in the Talmud, but it was a later prohibition that it appears Sephardic communities have accepted upon themselves. As a result, most Ashkenazi communities are not strict about separating fish from cheese or milk products. In fact, most Ashkenazi communities widely eat fish and milk products together. Some Ashkenazi communities are careful, but most eat it widely together. And of course, we have the classic bagel and lox with lox and cream cheese. That is a classic American Ashkenazi food. People often associate Jewish foods with Ashkenazim because 90% of the Jews in the United States are Ashkenazim. But it's a classic American Jewish food, bagels and lox. And Ashkenazi Jews, most Ashkenazim eat bagels and lox together. However, Sephardic Jews do not. Sephardic Jews do not mix milk or milk products with fish. Many Hasidic communities also do not. In the Chabad community, historically, most actually did not. separate milk and fish, however, do not eat milk and fish together. However, the Rebbe wrote about it, that we should not be concerned about it. Today, as far as I know, the Chabad community is not concerned about eating fish and cheese or milk together. And we serve it here for the Ashkenazim among us, but the Sephardim among us should be careful and not have fish and milk together. So bagels with lox and cheese is an exclusively Ashkenazi food. Sorry? Exclusively Jewish Ashkenazi food. Sephardim do not eat it. Now, because of this issue, because of this prohibition, so modern kosher certifications generally will still certify things that have dairy and fish in them, because for Ashkenazim it's kosher, and so they will certify it. And just as they certify, they'll certify kitniot, legumes on Passover for Sephardim, so they'll certify fish and dairy for Ashkenazim, but they will write on it that it is fish and dairy, so that the Sephardim know that it is fish and dairy, and their custom is not to eat it. But let's now address the big question, which is that the challenge with this whole prohibition that we've spoken about. The Talmud tells us don't eat fish and meat together because it's bad for smell and it leads to tzarat. Tzarat, either the original skin ailment mentioned in the Torah or perhaps leprosy. Now, today, with the best medicine that we have, we know, and it's not only today, this was mentioned already by scholars hundreds of years ago, in medieval times, that based on what they knew, that they don't know of any dangers of eating fish and meat together. So that leads really to two questions. Firstly, it leads to a question about the sages themselves. Were they incorrect? Could we say they made a mistake in creating this prohibition? Could they have made a mistake and incorrectly said that eating fish and meat together is dangerous when it's not really? Now, suggesting such a thing is problematic, because we believe that our sages who wrote down the early oral tradition were guided by divine inspiration, or in Hebrew, Ruach HaKodesh. If they were divinely inspired, how could they make such a mistake? And this is an issue for many medical things mentioned in the Talmud, most of which don't have direct impact on halacha and Jewish law, but this is particularly an issue for this law of not mixing fish and meat that they say is dangerous, but we don't know of any danger. We don't know of any health problems connected to eating fish and meat together. That's one issue. A second issue is that if indeed the sages were incorrect about this, then why should we be forbidden from eating fish and meat together today? Now, there are many commandments that we don't know the reason for. We have 613 commandments. We've spoken about this previously, that there are some commandments we don't understand. For example, the Torah forbids us from eating meat and milk together. And we have no logical explanation for the prohibition of eating milk and meat together. It is a chok. It falls into the category of mitzvahs that we do not understand the reason. And we spoke about this previously. We once did a class that we titled Why the Commandments Sometimes Make No Sense. And we spoke about this in detail, but some commandments do make sense. We keep Shabbat to remember how Hashem created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. We keep Passover to remember the Exodus. So a lot of the commandments do. We have a reason for them. A lot of commandments, we do not have a reason for them. The Torah says do it, so we do it. And so meat and milk is a classic example. We don't have a reason for the prohibition. So it's okay not to have a reason for a prohibition. But that is when you never had a reason to start with and the Torah said do it. I'm not going to tell you what. But here, when it came to fish and meat, The Talmud does say why. Gives us a reason because it's dangerous. But what happens if now we know that it's not dangerous? Yes, Debbie.
Well, I always thought it was because birth and death. Death of killing an animal and birth.
You're suggesting there's a reason because it's connecting birth and death. Okay. There are spiritual reasons, mystical reasons given for not mixing together milk and meat. I'm not going to get into them right now. Not for now. We discussed it when we did our class on milk and meat. But there's no straightforward reason. There's no clear, straightforward reason like don't keep Shabbat to remember how God created the world. There's no clear, easy symbolism to it. Yes, there might be symbolism, but it's mystical and it's not straightforward. Yes?
When the Torah says, don't boil it in its mother's mouth, is that just that specific act that would be prohibited? Or does it say...
Our oral tradition tells us that we're forbidden from cooking milk and meat together or eating milk and meat cooked together.
Well, I know that, but...
Why the Torah uses the words it uses is a very good question. We discussed it in our class on milk and meat.
I mean, it says
Yes.
it pretty clearly.
It does, and we did a class a few months ago where we spoke about why we don't take the Torah at face value. And we gave countless examples where the Torah says one thing, we believe it means something totally different. Okay, so let's get back to our two questions, right? Two questions. Firstly, were the sages incorrect in saying that it's dangerous to eat milk and, were the sages incorrect in saying that it's dangerous to eat meat and fish together? And secondly, if indeed it's not dangerous anymore, why can't we do it today? So there are two different approaches to answer this question. The first is given by the Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, one of the leading scholars of the 19th century, and he says that, well, the sages were correct in their times, but humans have changed. And he uses this answer to address many of the medical things that it says in the Talmud that are not accurate in today's medicine. And he says, well, humans changed. And what impacted humans then doesn't impact humans today. And indeed, we know humans have changed significantly over time. We evolve over time, and there is some debate as to how much humans have changed and whether that can really answer all the questions of all the medical statements in the Talmud that don't seem to hold anymore and how to square that. That's discussion of its own, exactly whether that can really resolve all the many, many medical statements in the Talmud that don't seem to stand anymore with modern medicine. But at least that's Chassam Sofer's approach, that people have changed. What was dangerous then is not dangerous today. Well, then that raises the second question. If indeed it was dangerous then and it's not dangerous today, why can we not eat it today? So the Chassam Sofer explains that we have a rule in general in halacha, in Jewish law, that once the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Council of Judaism, forbade something, or commanded something, even if they made the rule for a specific reason, and that reason is no longer relevant, the prohibition still remains. Only the Sanhedrin themselves, a Supreme Council, when we had it, have the authority under very limited conditions to override the ruling of a previous Sanhedrin. But since we don't have a Sanhedrin today, and even if we had a Sanhedrin, it wouldn't be an easy thing to do, without an official vote and ruling from the Sanhedrin that says this rule is now void, we must continue keeping that rule. And we have countless other examples. One classic example is that we wash our hands before we eat bread. Why do we wash our hands before we eat bread? Because in temple times, the sages said to wash your hands before eating bread in order to eat things betahara, when you are ritually pure, because they would have to eat truma, which was the special grain or produce given to the Kohen, or sacrificial foods. And those things had to be eaten with purity. And because of that, our sages said one should eat everything with purity and be with ritual purity. And because of that, they said before eating bread, one should wash their hands in order to purify their hands. Today, though, we don't separate truma anymore, or at least we don't eat it with purity. We don't have sacrificial foods anymore because we don't have a temple standing. We don't bring sacrifices, so we don't need to eat things with purity anymore. The reason for the law seems to have fallen away, and yet we still wash our hands because once the Sanhedrin made a rule, it stands, and until they retract it, it stays. Says the Chassam Sofer, the same thing over here, even though it was for a very specific reason, that they banned don't eat fish and meat together because it's not safe. And then, indeed, he believes it wasn't safe. However, once they made that rule stands. Even if the reason for the rule is gone because times have changed, nevertheless, we must still keep the same rule, and it is still forbidden for us to eat fish and meat together. That is one approach as to how we can explain the prohibition today. There's a second very interesting approach to answer the question, and that is that sometimes the sages say, don't do something, and they gave you a specific reason, but the reason they gave you is not the real reason. And this approach is Maimonides had a very famous son who's known as Reb Avraham ben Harambam, the son of Maimonides. And he takes this approach for a number of things, including notably there is a mitzvah that one should wash the tips of their fingers before, at the end of a meal after eating bread. We wash the tips of our fingers, mayim achronim it's called, after waters. And the reason why they say to wash the tips of your fingers is because you can have salt left on, and then you should on your fingers, and that salt is unhealthy. Now, we don't know of any particular reason why, if you indeed do have salt on your fingers, why it should be unhealthy. And so he says, well, there's really another reason, and he gives another reason. It's really in preparation for the blessing after the meal, the Birchat HaMazon. However, they wanted people to be really careful about it. And in order to get people to be careful about it, they said it's dangerous. By saying it's dangerous, people took it more seriously. So some suggest that we can use the same argument here, that the sages forbade fish and meat for some other reason, eating them together. They wanted people to be careful about it and take it seriously. They said it's dangerous, even though even then there would have not been any particular danger. If that were to be the case, what then would be the reason that the sages actually forbade it? Why would they forbid us from eating meat and fish together? So I don't know. I don't think anybody can suggest that they would know the reason, since they didn't give us another reason, right? So we don't really know what, if that's indeed the case, we don't know what the real reason would then be. However, there is a mystical explanation to this prohibition of not eating milk and not eating meat and fish together. There is a mystical explanation to it. Maybe this is what they were thinking. Maybe not. I don't know. But it does explain to us in Kabbalah that, okay, thank you. It does explain to us in Kabbalah an additional reason for the prohibition of not mixing fish and meat. And that is, in Kabbalah it explains that there are, in addition to our own universe, Hashem created countless other universes. And we once did a class where we spoke about this in detail, about the Jewish belief in parallel universes. So we do believe in parallel universes, and we believe that Hashem created, in addition to our own universe, he created countless other universes. Kabbalah explains that the universes that Hashem created divide into two categories. There is what's called Alma, in Aramaic, Alma de'itkasya, which is universes that are hidden, and Alma de'itgalya, universes that are revealed. What is the difference? Alma de'itkasya are universes that are actively aware of their creator. They're aware of Hashem's being and aware of Hashem's existence. If you are aware of the infinite creator, you don't pay attention to yourself. They don't see themselves. They just see themselves as being subsumed entirely within the infinity of the Creator. They see themselves as drops in the infinite ocean. They don't see themselves as being independent of the Creator. That is called Alma Kasya, hidden universes, because in those universes, the creations in those universes everything is covered. All they see is the Creator. Then there are universes where the Creator is hidden. If the Creator is hidden, then creations can be aware of themselves because the Creator doesn't overwhelm them. And that would be very much, our universe would fall into such a category where creations see themselves as independent of the Creator. We don't see the Creator, or we don't have automatic awareness of our Creator, and that leads us to think of ourselves as independent beings. And so we would be living in an Alma Itgalia, in a revealed world where the Creator is hidden, creation is then revealed. Now, it further explains in Kabbalah that on our planet, on Earth itself, the oceans represent Alma Itkasya. They represent the universes, the hidden universes. Why? The ocean is covered with water, and everything in the ocean is entirely subsumed in the ocean. In fact, if you look at the ocean with a naked eye, you don't see anything inside. All you see is water, even though it's teeming with life inside the water. All you see is the water, similar to the Alma Itkasya, the hidden universes, where all you see is the Creator. You don't see the creation because it's overwhelmed and subsumed entirely within its Creator. While land would be land on our planet would represent Alma Itgalia, the revealed world, because on land you can see things stand independently, and even though we are also surrounded by air on land, however, the air does not block us. We don't see the air, and instead we see all the individual things that are around us. So, taking this a step further, Kabbalah explains that creations in the oceans, then, meaning fish and things that exist in the oceans, are therefore on a much higher spiritual plane than creations on dry land. Creations in the oceans represent Alma Itkasya, the hidden universes, while creations on dry land represent Alma Itgalia, the revealed universes. And because of that, firstly, we're told that's why, because of the great spiritual power of creations in the oceans, that's why eating fish is a very powerful thing. And that's why we should make an effort to eat fish on Shabbat. That's why we do eat fish on Shabbat. We eat meat in order to have ta'anug, in order to have pleasure on Shabbat. It's pleasurable to eat meat or fowl, but we also eat fish because of the great spiritual power of fish. And this also then explains why we would avoid mixing creations from the oceans with creations on land. Creations from the ocean on the oceans are great spiritual creations. Creations on land don't have that same great spirituality, and because of that difference, we avoid. That's at least a Kabbalistic reason why we would avoid mixing them. So, in conclusion, hopefully now you know the laws of not mixing fish and meat together, and the Sephardic custom of not mixing milk or dairy and meat together. And I think it's also important to note both from the general rules of kosher, but particularly from the explanation I just gave you about the differences between fish and meat, that when we eat or when we benefit from anything in this world, we have to be very, very cognizant and very aware of the power of what we are doing. Every time we eat something, we say a bracha before we eat to recognize that Hashem gave it to us, and recognize that each thing gives us very great spiritual power. In last week's Parsha, we said that Hashem wants us to know, Ki lo al halechem levado yichyeh ha'adam, man does not live on bread alone, Ki al kol motza pi Hashem yichyeh ha'adam, but on that which comes out of the word of Hashem, man lives. In other words, we don't live just from calories. That's not what, or protein. That's not what gives us life. It's not the actual food and the molecules that we're eating that gives us life. It is Hashem's power, and more importantly, the spiritual power in that food that really gives us life. And so when we eat, rather than just eating to satisfy our hunger or because we happen to really like the food, instead we should eat and recognize the Creator who has given us that food and the spiritual power within that food, and the spiritual power within that food, and eat, therefore, in a meaningful and aware, cognizant way. So thank you all for joining once again, and thank you, Marla. She's not here for sponsoring our breakfast. We will be back next week, God willing. Next week, we will talk about divorce in Judaism. Yes. Divorce. We did a class once on Agunot, so I'm not going to